Hello and welcome to another screencast, this time in the types of guidance. Just a reminder in regards to these PowerPoints. So the yellow text boxes are tasks for students, the green text boxes are for note taking for students, blue text boxes for differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes are for teaching and learning strategies specifically for the practitioner. So what does this syllabus say about this topic? Well, it's a very popular topic in regards to exam questions, so it's likely that you will get a question or two on the types of guidance. So you need to be aware of the different types of guidance that exist in sport. You need to be able to identify the different examples for each type of guidance, and most importantly, you need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of each type of guidance, okay, and especially with reference to looking at beginners and elite performers. Okay, so first and foremost, we need to know what each type of guidance is and a definition of guidance. So when we're looking at guidance, we're talking about a method of sort of putting across information to a performer. So we've got four types of guidance in regards to how we put that information across, and we can do that visually, so through things like seeing, demonstrations, as we'll go on to in a minute and talk about, verbal. Okay, so this is things that we can hear as a performer. Okay, we can also give guidance through manual assistance. Okay, so that's through the actual assistance of movement, so physical movement, as you can see in the diagram there. And mechanical is the last one. So this is the uses of aids and objects to help with the technique of the performer. Okay, so let's look at first and foremost visual guidance. Okay, so for this type of guidance, we're talking about when a performer can see the skill being performed or practiced. So you can see the diagram there of Judy Murray, okay, and she is demonstrating, you can see she's showing through a visual type of guidance how to serve. Okay, so ultimately it says there, visual guidance can show the skill as a whole movement. It can be broken down into steps or applied with a real situation. This will include things like demonstrations, as I've said, images, video, and observation. So pause your video here and see if you can give any sporting examples of where visual guidance might be appropriate. Okay, so hopefully you completed that task. As we can see there in the diagram, okay, you've got the serve being demonstrated, but this type of guidance can be used throughout, isn't it? So if we're learning, for example, how to pass a ball in rugby, we can use a demonstration. If we're trampolining, for example, and I want to show my performers how to seat drop, then I can use images. Okay, so I can demonstrate them around the trampoline with images of a seat drop, for example. Or we can use video analysis, so we can actually show a short film or footage of that skill being executed. And ultimately, when we're looking at that demonstration, we might be observing it as well. Okay, so let's move on to verbal guidance. So verbal guidance looks at this idea of giving the observer, we're giving them verbal feedback ultimately, okay, after watching the performance. So this can be through things like coaching points. So the manager or the coach might give some tips to the performer verbally. Also be through feedback. Okay, so verbal feedback, whether it's positive or negative. Okay, we can also look at peer feedback. So can the performers give each other feedback, and that can be done verbally as well. Okay, and we can also, as a teacher or as a coach, can provide questioning, and sometimes this can promote things like self-evaluation, so the performer thinking about their own performance through different types of questioning. Often verbal feedback can be sort of given before, it can be given during and after the practice, ultimately in regards to performance. Again, pause your video here, think about what are some of the sporting examples that we can give in regards to verbal guidance. Okay, so things that you could have talked about here is once you've watched the performer execute their actual performance, then ultimately the verbal feedback will then be given by the coach or the teacher. That was an excellent tuck somersault there on the trampoline, well done. Okay, or we could have mentioned, actually, can we make sure we point our toes a little bit more when we're executing that seat drop. Okay, so that's a type of verbal guidance. Okay, it could be at the end of the match. You can see if you're going into extra time there in regards to the video, or it could even be at halftime, isn't it? Some verbal guidance might be given by the coach or by the manager. Okay, so let's move on to manual guidance next. So this idea is where we give manual guidance to a performer, and this is through sort of physically guiding them. So this is supported by the coach. So often things like gymnastics will use physical manipulation, and ultimately, okay, so it could be through things like a handstand, as you can see there, in regards to this specific task. Okay, it might even be sometimes in trampoline, and okay, so if we're on the trampoline with the performer, we might actually use some manual guidance in regards to helping them with their tuck somersault, whether it be front somersault or a back somersault. Okay, and ultimately this is normally provided during the practice, okay, rather than the performance itself. Okay, it's done during practice time. So again, pause your video here. I've already given you some examples, and you think of other examples that we could use for manual guidance. Okay, so other than gymnastics and trampolining, as we've talked about, we could even look at things like tennis, okay, and holding that tennis racket with the student and actually helping them follow through with their forehand or their backhand, for that matter. Okay, it can also be in things like javelin, couldn't it? We could actually assist and help that performer hold the javelin and actually release it both at the same time, okay, and that might help, obviously, in regards to the performance. And finally, if we move on to mechanical, so mechanical looks at this idea of where we're using guidance, we use types of technology or a piece of equipment to help aid the performance, okay, help aid the learning, and when we're practicing a skill. Ultimately, this is normally in the early stages of learning. So we can see there, if we're trying to practice, for example, a somersault of some sort on the trampoline, okay, and we're not using manual guidance, so we don't have the coach on the trampoline, then we can use things like technology, harness, for example, okay, to help with that. Okay, so can you think of any more examples that require mechanical guidance? Okay, so hopefully you come up with a few more examples. If we look at swimming, for example, okay, the use of floats can really help. Okay, so we could have the performer holding the float out in front of them and just focus on our feet and on our legs in regards to kicking within the water. Okay, we could have mentioned, for example, a bowling machine or some sort of feeding machine, whether it be in table tennis or in cricket, that we can use, and that can help in regards to mechanical guidance. So feeding that ball into the machine and then the balls come flying out can help in regards to mechanical guidance as well. Look at this last question here as well in regards to mechanical guidance. So why has it become more widespread in sports? So just pause your video here, just try and come up with a sentence or two answering that question. Okay, so ultimately, obviously, mechanical guidance now has become really widespread in sport because ultimately we have an advancement in technology. Okay, so technology is playing a real big part in sport today, not only in terms of refining and changing performance, but also it's used in feedback and guidance, especially for coaches to help with their specific athletes. So we just got a greater advancement in technology, and that's why it's now being used more widespread, because obviously some of that technology becomes cheaper. Okay, if it's massively produced, okay, it's more accessible for lots of different countries. Okay, so next question. So what are the benefits and negatives of visual guidance when teaching a skill? Just want you to pause your video here and see if you can answer that question. Okay, so hopefully you've answered that question. You've looked at both the positives, the benefits, and the negatives in regards to visual guidance. So for positives, so things like why we might use visual guidance, it's obviously very good for the beginner stage. Why is that? Because they can obviously clearly see the skill being performed. They can see what they need to do in that particular performance. Obviously, if the demonstration is good and correct and clear, okay, it's going to help that performer be able to copy that skill. Okay, so we need to make sure the demonstration is often good technically and also correct and clear. The learner will pick up key cues. By cues, we're talking about attentional focus. Okay, so key specific things that they're focused on within that skill. So it could be elements of pointing toes in the seat drop. It could be where we put our hands, okay, by our hips, for example, how we land on the bed, making sure that we extend our legs, obviously, as we go into that seat drop position. We also, as it says there, the learner understands the various signals and different gestures. So that could be through a tactical point of view. If a coach is trying to get a signal across and is on the opposite side to the performer. Okay, so hand gestures and signals can sometimes help in regards to visual guidance. And ultimately, it's seen as being the most effective way in helping learn a new skill. If we can see it being done, it's much more clear to us than listening to it. What are some of the negatives and disadvantages maybe of visual guidance? Ultimately, that demonstration must be clear and accurate. So if it's not, okay, and if we have that image which is inaccurate, or the video and the demonstration is inaccurate, then ultimately the learner is going to pick up poor technique. So we've got to make sure that that demonstration is ultimately very, very correct. And not only that, obviously needs to be very detailed, especially for elite performers. Elite performers know what they're doing. So if they're watching a visual guidance, okay, they need to make sure that they've got enough information there, it's specific to them, okay, so they can clearly see what they need to do to improve their technique. Okay, so let's move on to the benefits and negatives for the other types of guidance. Again, I now want you to sort of just draw a table, 3 tables in your book, just with 2 columns per table. Just leave about sort of 8 to 10 lines maximum, okay, and see if you can jot down some benefits, some negatives to the other 3. So looking at verbal, manual, and mechanical. All right, so if we look at verbal first and foremost, some of the key points here to mention in regards to positives. Okay, obviously verbal guidance is important and good if it's clear, if it's short, and if it's relevant. Okay, but too much information can be a little bit negative for the beginner, because ultimately, well, any human being for that matter, if we give too much guidance, too much talk time, then obviously we're going to lose attention, we're going to lose focus. The use of key words can also focus the technique. If we give praise and encouragement, okay, that can be a benefit in regards to verbal guidance, okay, because it can reinforce, it can strengthen that stimulus response bond. At A level, you'll be looking at that. We'll be looking also at the fact that it's helpful, it accompanies things like visual guidance. So when we give a thumbs up, for example, in a visual sense, okay, then reinforcing that message sometimes with a verbal piece of encouragement. So well done, that was an excellent job there, good job. Okay, things like that is really useful to accompany that. And obviously it's good for elite performers as well, because it can provide motivation. Sometimes if that verbal guidance is negative, it can really spur on our elite performers. Some of the negatives of verbal guidance. So as I said there, learners can only remember a limited amount of spoken information. So ultimately we don't want to talk for too long. That's why, for example, try and keep these presentations to a maximum of 15 minutes. It needs to be simple. It needs to be short, sort of for the beginners, okay, and young performers. And ultimately it's difficult sometimes to communicate complex and difficult tasks, okay, and things like tactics. So it can sometimes come across with mixed messages. If we look at manual next, obviously this is good for things like confidence in the performer. It's obviously good for safety reasons. So if we're producing and performing a handstand, then we need that support from the coach, for example. It reduces the chances of injury, and ultimately it allows that experience of the skill through this type of learning. See some of the disadvantages. Learner might be too dependent on the coach at this stage, okay, so sometimes we need to let go, don't we, as a coach or as a teacher, to actually just get the performer to perform that move. Also, if we direct the movements, if we have too much hands-on, it can reduce this idea of kinesthetic feel, okay, so where we don't feel our body position, our movement is correct. So again, we're too dependent on the actual coach. And obviously in terms of safeguarding in sport, obviously there can be issues there in regards to child safety. And finally, if we look at mechanical, some of the benefits, obviously using types of technology, it gives confidence. We create obviously a safe space, and it does help with some of those kinesthetic that kinesthetic feel in terms of movement. And some of the negatives, obviously, it can be too expensive. Okay, we might be too dependent on it. And obviously, we can't just use it in isolation. It needs to be relevant to the whole performance. Okay, lastly, in terms of teaching and learning strategies, just read through the whiteboard activity. I'm not going to explain it to you just there myself, but it's a really, really good task. The kids really enjoy that. And obviously, there's lots of practice exam questions as well. So good luck with this specific topic.